Good morning. This is structured data capture. My name is Lloyd McKenzie. I am one of the initial editors of FHIR. I'm a co-chair of a whole whack of things. Most relevant for today, I was the technical lead for, thank you. There we go. I was the technical lead for the U.S. Office of the National Coordinator's Structured Data Capture project when it ran. Actually, it ended about a year ago and ran for about 2 years prior to that. But I'm also going to be involved in the next iteration of structured data capture in FHIR, and therefore have a pretty good sense about how it works. Structured data capture makes use of a number of resources that hopefully you've had a chance to hear about at some of the preceding tutorials here at DevDays. If not, definitely grab the slides or watch the videos when they come out to get a bit more up to date on questionnaire and value sets and data element, which is now structure definition, to get a sense of how those things work. Today I'm going to focus specifically on the structured data capture project and what we can do with that. We're going to look at what was the scope of that project, what does it provide, what does it support. We'll look at what are the use cases that drove it and what is some of those use cases are fully relevant to you. We'll talk about some of the mapping strategies that are used within SDC, and finally we'll look at where SDC is going next. And some of that isn't nailed down yet. I'm actually writing the project scope statement for that on my way home tomorrow. So if you have some thoughts about where you would like SDC to go, come chat with me today and you can have some influence on that. Structured data capture was started in the US by the Office of the National Coordinator, which is their body that sort of helps to guide healthcare standards. And there's actually two separate SDC projects. One with IHE, which actually started before the one with FHIR, because FHIR didn't really exist or wasn't anything that was seen as something that could help in this space at the time that ONC first identified their requirements. But FHIR came along and they decided, you know what, this FHIR thing might be a good way of making this work as well. So they actually ran two parallel projects. And they had two major objectives with SDC. The first was providing a standardized way of sharing data elements, and that was specific to the FHIR project. They had requirements from National Cancer Institute and National Library of Medicine and a few other governmental organizations that had these huge repositories of data elements and that were sort of seen as being key to getting interoperability to happen, but there wasn't a good way of sharing those and having consistency in how applications produce them and consume them. The second, which was shared with the IHE project, was this ability to define forms or questionnaires in a standardized way, be able to pass them around and render them consistently, and then to be able to fill out those forms and pass around the filled out responses consistently and easily, but also being able to automatically fill them in so that, I'm sure you have seen numerous governmental forms where you're filling in your name and your address and your phone number and your date of birth and all of this other stuff over and over and over and over again. And it's no different in the healthcare space, except that you're also filling in things like when was your last menstrual cycle and a whole bunch of other information that you answer the questions on the form, and then you answer the questions to your general practitioner, and then you answer the questions to your nurse. And anytime that we can reduce the amount of time that people are repeatedly filling the stuff out, and also the number of times that people have to transcribe it, we improve quality. So that was the objective, and each of these two focuses, data elements and questionnaires, we produced an implementation guide for in FHIR. Structured data capture is publicly available. You can go grab it off the web. If you go to the FHIR website, FHIR homepage, and then you scroll all the way down to the bottom. You'll see a section called Implementation Guides with 2 links under it. One is those published by HL7 and affiliates in the FHIR Foundation, and one is other IGs. If you click on the first link, you'll get to a page that lists a whole bunch of implementation guides, and if you scroll down a little ways, you will find structured data capture. Those are our 2 implementation guides. SDC is the one that focuses on questionnaire and questionnaire response and automatic population of those. SDC-DE stands for data element, and that's the specification that focuses on standardizing data element exchange. Data elements have been around as a concept for quite a while. It means that you're identifying a particular piece of information, like a patient name or a patient gender or a deceased date or something like that, defining what this piece of information means, and identifying what it looks like. So what is the data type? If it's a coded element, what are the allowed values? So for gender, is it just male and female, or male and female and other? What are the possible values? Are there constraints on terms of length or anything else? And a lot of the work around standardizing data elements has happened in the clinical research space, where a lot of the data gets captured on something called case report forms, or CRFs, where every single study has these forms that they use to capture information about the patients or the subjects of the study. And it's kind of useful in the research space if data that's captured by one study is comparable with data that's captured using a different study. And it's really hard to compare that information if the data on the forms is being captured in different ways. If one captures gender as just male and female, and one captures it as male and female and other, and maybe a couple of other possibilities, it becomes very difficult to share the data across those. And even becomes difficult if different codes or different values are being used to represent the notions of things like male and female. So having these standardized data elements in principle allows data to be captured consistently, even if you're using different forms, and then that data becomes more comparable. So folks that were engaged in doing a lot of research and supporting a lot of research had built up these immense libraries of data elements and had worked together on an ISO standard called 1179, but that didn't really define a syntax for actually sharing those data elements. And so we were called upon to help with providing that kind of standard syntax. In terms of the second part of SDC, the questionnaire resource in FHIR is relatively simple. We try to not be over-ambitious and do things that we don't think that most systems in the world can do. But when we get into areas like clinical research, there's often more intense requirements. You want to have tight control over the flow of your questionnaire. You want to be able to hide certain questions. You want to be able to embed instructions. You want to have control over the colors of things, have certain things render in italics, etc. And that wasn't necessarily functionality that was part of the base questionnaire specification. So we needed to add some extensions, and we wanted those extensions to be defined in a consistent way, and we wanted to make sure that we were going to meet the needs of a number of these different types of research and oncology and other questionnaires. As well, within FHIR, pretty much everything is optional, which allows for people to use the specification whatever way they need it, but it doesn't do a heck of a lot for interoperability. If I'm creating a questionnaire and I'm expecting you to be able to understand everything that I'm writing in that instance, and you are going to ignore it or ignore large portions of it when you're rendering, things aren't going to work very well. So by setting sort of a minimum set of, you must at least understand and be able to render and deal with these parts of the questionnaire, we could get greater interoperability, and we could have people authoring questionnaires and be confident that anybody else who claimed to be SDC conformant would be able to take that questionnaire and render it appropriately. And so our challenge with the project was figuring out what was reasonable, what could we reasonably expect the implementer community to be able to support in their systems. As mentioned previously, filling out questionnaires is not something that most people like to do, particularly when you're dealing with general practitioners being asked to fill out a research questionnaire, which they're probably not getting paid for. They want to be able to fill it out as quickly as possible. Same sort of thing in the financial area. You get a form from an insurer that you need to fill out some additional information in order for you to get paid or for the patient to get reimbursed. You generally don't get money for filling out those forms, so whatever we can do to make it faster and easier is a good thing. Also, there's a challenge that people will miss data. So maybe that data exists somewhere in the EHR, but it's not at the top of mind by the person who's filling out the form, so they skip that part. They don't think it applies, or yeah, whatever, I don't have time, so I'm not going to fill it out. Or maybe they transcribe it wrong. They thought that your most recent blood pressure was X, but in fact it was Y, because they went and looked up the wrong one. So if we can extract the information from the source of truth, which was hopefully the electronic health record, then we can make sure that we're getting accurate information submitted in those forms. So if we can automatically fill them in, that's going to be helpful. In order to automatically fill them in, we need to have a way inside the questionnaire to be clear about what does this question actually mean and where should the data come from. So that's what we had to do as part of SDC. Note that when you're automatically filling in the questionnaire, that doesn't mean that the user, the submitter of the questionnaire, is not in control. People can still take the data and say, yeah, I understand that that's what you got from the EHR, but that's not what I'm submitting to the insurer. They don't need to know that, or actually that's not quite accurate. I'm going to change the value, or I'm going to add some additional content. And of course, you have to fill in all the information that might not have been stored in your system, or at least stored in a way that was automatically extractable. The reality is, when we're looking at electronic health records and looking at all the demands that are being placed on electronic health record systems, being able to render really complex questionnaires is not necessarily the highest priority for a lot of them. And we can't expect that those capabilities are going to show up anytime soon. Some of them might choose to support SDC out of the starting blocks, but many are burdened by, in the US, meaningful use and things like that. But elsewhere, there's other regulations that they're struggling with and trying to deal with FHIR in general. And so we felt, both in the IHE space and in the FHIR space, that it's be helpful to have a fallback. So rather than saying, here's the FHIR questionnaire instance, you render it yourself inside the EHR, to have the ability to say, if you don't know how to render it, go off to this link and we will send you an HTML form that you can then just run with inside your embedded browser, and that will handle capturing all of the data and handle submission. Or alternatively, click on this link and it will take you to an external web page that you don't even have to render, and people can fill out the form there and click on the submit link, and that will go into the research database or into the payers database or wherever the data is supposed to go. And when we do those things, we still wanted the ability to automatically populate the questionnaire. So that means not only saying, can you please render this questionnaire for me, but also, can you please render this questionnaire, and here's a bunch of the patient's data as a CDA document or as a bundle of FHIR resources that you can then leverage to automatically fill in, hopefully, some of that information. Within structured data capture, we use two different terms. We use the term pre-population and auto-population. So in pre-population, the EHR doesn't have to do any of the work. The EHR simply exposes data in a way that it knows how, which in the US is typically right now as a CCDA document, but more and more it's also becoming possible for systems to expose it as a collection of FHIR resources. And they then pass that information off to a third party that takes care of filling in the questionnaire for them. Auto-population, on the other hand, is a situation where the EHR knows how to fill in the questionnaire itself. So no third party is required. It has the data locally in its database, extracts the data from the database, and fills it into the data element. So mapping process is slightly different. In the first case, you are mapping from a standardized representation like CCDA or FHIR or maybe even version 2. In the second case, the mapping is from whatever internal data structure that electronic health record system has. And so they may do the mapping on the basis of, I know that this column in my database corresponds to CCDA element XYZ or FHIR resource element XYZ, but they're doing the mapping in a slightly different way. We defined 3 operations in FHIR on Questionnaire, populate, populate HTML, and populate link, that do those functions. So populate, you identify a particular questionnaire, possibly you specify some data that you have available, FHIR resources, CDA, whatever, and you will get back a questionnaire response resource that the EHR is then responsible for rendering. Populate HTML gives you back a binary resource that contains a bunch of HTML that you render locally, and populate link just gives you back a URL, generally a temporary URL, that you can then navigate to and is filled in with the relevant information. This is a summary of structured data capture. We have 3 main application roles. We've got a data element registry, which is the repository that stores all of these data element definitions. We've got our form designers, which are the systems that know how to define questionnaires, and they're going to go look up data elements so they can reference those as part of the form authoring process. And then we've got a form manager that holds these forms and also supports this ability to automatically populate the data. And so they're working with questionnaires, they're also working with value sets, because of course when you're working with questionnaires, quite often it's pick from the following list, and we use value sets to do that. Not shown on this diagram is also the form submitter, where you're filling out the form information and then sending that off to someone. Structured data capture is useful in a number, or potentially useful in a number of different areas. Clinical research was one of the major drivers, because they do use forms a lot in that space, but it's also relevant in the public health space. So anytime that you have a reportable incident, an adverse event, or something else that happens and you need to submit a form, you can use structured data capture for that. Any place in the insurance area where you're doing a pre-authorization or a special authorization or submitting a claim. But forms get used in all sorts of other places as well, for administration purposes, for admitting purposes, and anything that allows you to fill those in can be helpful. When we're populating questionnaires, there's a number of different ways of going about it. The way that was presumed to be the preferred way of populating questionnaires with SDC initially involved linking to data elements. So inside the questionnaire, on each question we would say this question corresponds to data element 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You go look up data element 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the data element says this thing corresponds to this path in CDA or this path in FHIR. And you then use that to figure out where in your database that particular piece of data is. In practice, I haven't seen anybody actually use that mechanism for doing population or pre-population, in part because data elements often don't have absolute context. So you might have a data element that talks about the notion of gender or address, but it's not necessarily going to distinguish between patient gender or provider gender or family member gender, etc. And therefore, it's difficult to have robust mappings between those and data sources like CDA or FHIR or whatever. As well, when you're working inside of a complex questionnaire, you will often have repeating structures inside repeating structures inside repeating structures, and you need to do your mappings on the basis of collections of data elements. And you have to understand those collections, and you don't necessarily have mapping points to data elements, which are very small pieces of data, when you're trying to figure out how do I map this particular repeating element and how to map this particular repeating element. So in practice, data elements haven't been as useful in automatic population as we had hoped. That doesn't mean that they're not useful in the questionnaire space. They still help you standardize what kind of answers are you getting, what kind of questions are you asking. It still makes it possible to have questionnaires that are created by 5 different research projects do so more consistently and gather data that is more comparable. It's just not that useful in terms of being able to automatically map data from databases or CDA or FHIR or version 2 into and potentially out of a form. Second approach that we defined is to use concept map and questionnaire, where the concept map says this particular concept here maps into questionnaire, this particular question. And that works a little bit better because it's actually designed on the basis of the questionnaire itself. And it's relatively easy to do because you don't have to learn a formal mapping language. The challenge with it is that as soon as you get into anything that's a little bit complicated, concept map tends to fall down, because concept map is intended to map vocabularies, not necessarily data structures, which then takes us now into structure map, which didn't really exist the first time we did SDC, but it's something that we're going to be looking at this time as part of SDC Release 2. Structured data capture is published as a US realm implementation guide. But really the only thing that makes it US realm specific is that the questionnaires are defined as being able to point to data elements, and data elements, one of the things that they have is a definitional property value pair that helps to define what is the meaning of this data element. And in the SDC profiles, we said that that must draw from LOINC and US SNOMED and RX norm, and of course that's not something that necessarily makes sense outside the US. In fact, it's questionable whether it even makes sense inside the US as a way of defining the meaning of the word. So that's the only part of the SDC implementation guide that is US specific. And if you don't necessarily care about the data element mappings to questionnaire in terms of making use of automatic population, etc., then it's not US specific at all. So it's really a specification that can be used anywhere, and it's something that we certainly hope to see used many places in the world. As mentioned, the FHIR version of the SDC specification and the IHE version of the SDC specification developed in parallel, and they do have differences. The IHE specification doesn't really deal with data element at all. It's built on top of IHE's RFD specification. They like acronyms as much as HL7 does, which is request forms for data capture. They have a custom XML syntax that they use for defining questionnaires, and their syntax actually combines the notion of the questionnaire and the questionnaire response. So you can send them both together as a single XML instance. They don't do JSON, at least they didn't. I haven't looked at it recently. FHIR, when we initially did questionnaire, actually had the same thing. The answers and the questions all as one resource instance. But after a couple of connectathons, we moved away from that because we found that it didn't work terribly well for complex questionnaires. The two specifications have evolved in a fairly different direction. FHIR has this notion of the 80%, where we only include things in the specification if we think that most systems are going to use them, and then we have this extension capability. Because IHE was working from a custom schema, their design tended to include a little bit more complexity as part of the core spec than FHIR did, and their approach to accessibility is a bit different than ours. Structured data capture is coming to life again. ONC funding ran out a little over a year ago, and so the project published and balloted and was successful, and they declared victory, and we're done. But of course, FHIR continues to evolve, and as FHIR evolves, there's a need to update the implementation guide. National Library of Medicine is providing some funding to make that happen. The initial project is probably going to focus only on the questionnaire question and response implementation guide, not on the data element implementation guide. That doesn't mean that we won't eventually update that one as well. It just won't be as part of this project. That will include a number of things. One is updating the implementation guide to align with Release 4. There's changes happening to questionnaire and questionnaire response, primarily around alignment with the request and event patterns that you may have heard about in the workflow tutorial a couple of days ago. But there will probably be a few other changes there as well, and we need to update the implementation guide to reflect that. We have had some people implement SDC or something very like SDC. They've made a few tweaks because they felt they needed to. We want to receive feedback about what those tweaks were and see if we can make some changes to the specification that would allow them to be conformant and hopefully to make the specification more useful for others so that you don't have to tweak it. So we'll be looking at adding some capabilities to questionnaires and possibly even shifting some things from extensions into core or vice versa based on the feedback of the implementer community. We're also going to take a serious look at what actually works well in terms of pre-population and auto-population. We sort of approached it from a theoretical perspective last time, but we now have some concrete experiences with people, particularly using resources where people are taking information out of FHIR repositories and automatically putting that into questionnaires, and also doing the reverse. So I'm going to send you a questionnaire because that's very easy for you to fill out. You don't have to understand any of the resources, you just have to understand one questionnaire response. You fill in the answers to all of the questions in a very nice, human-friendly way. All the data is captured consistently. And then once I've got that questionnaire response, I extract all of that information and use it to populate my patient resource and my allergy resources and my medication statement resources and maybe my care plan resources, and have that data accessible in a way that works well for analysis. Because questionnaire by itself, or questionnaire response by itself, isn't terribly suited for analysis. You can't search on it easily, and you can't do statistics, etc. And you can't rent, and you can't pass that information around inside FHIR in the same way that you can once you've extracted things into allergy intolerance or encounter, etc. So we'll be looking at what are the best ways of doing that mapping and extraction. And we will probably drop the US-specific constraints and migrate the specification to be a true international specification that's broadcast as being leverageable by everyone, because it's sitting in the US-specific area means that lots of people ignore it who might be able to take advantage of it, and there isn't really that much in it that's US-specific, and what is US-specific isn't proving terribly useful, at least to the implementers who have used it so far, so we'll generalize it and make it available for everyone. And I actually have time for questions.
Is there also a collaboration with Epic or whatever EHR system that they can implement the questionnaires in their system and do the mapping for you?
So the question is whether there is collaboration with Epic and Cerner and other EHR vendors, and whether they can actually support this and do the mappings internally, etc. I actually was chatting with Cerner last night at the wonderful reception about exactly this topic. And their response is they're driven by customers. So they have tons and tons and tons of stuff on their plates. And while they look at this and say, yeah, that's a really cool idea, that would be fun, how quickly they get to it is going to be very much driven by the customer saying, yes, we need to have this functionality. The two primary drivers for SDC right now are probably the research community and the payer community. The payer community has trouble driving EHR behavior because they don't directly purchase EHRs themselves. And those who do purchase EHRs tend to not be super driven by what would make life easier for payers, which is a challenge because payers are actually pretty important to the healthcare community, and doing things that made their lives easier might actually make everybody's lives easier, but it's not a direct line of influence to the EHR vendor community. So the primary driver to get EHR vendors, producers to support something like structured data capture will probably be through the research community, because that's something that tends to be a more direct driver of customers of EHRs. And so the ability to be able to automatically fill in case report forms and improve the quality of the data and reduce duplicate entry will hopefully be attractive to a number of the clients of EHR vendors who will then say, we need you to have SDC support when we get that done. And then because it's FHIR and they already support FHIR, it's not hopefully a huge leap for them to take advantage of that. We will certainly be working to engage with the EHR community as part of the next release of SDC. So if they're willing to come or review or provide feedback, we will be trying to get that from them, so that whatever we specify, when and if their client base says we want this, they don't then look at the spec and go, well, that's great, you want it, but there's no chance of us being able to do that. We want to make sure that the specification reflects something that they're actually able to do and happy to do once they have people who are asking for it. Other questions? Yeah.
Suppose we have a kind of a questionnaire wherein if we answer a question A, question B should appear, and if we answer to a specific question, more of kind of a jumping logic.
Yeah.
So does FHIR SDC talk about such jumping logics, or that can be handled?
Right. So the question is, if you have a questionnaire that's designed where when you provide one particular answer to a question, that then turns on or off other questions, and whether that's something that's actually supported as part of the questionnaire resource. And I'm just going to bring up the questionnaire resource. Let me make that bigger. Is that readable at the back? Okay. So I'm going to bring the pretty picture view up. The short answer is yes, we can do that. So it's handled by this enable when structure. And the way it works is questionnaires are built up of a collection of items. And items can be groups, they can be individual questions, they can be just display text of this questionnaire was created by XYZ with funding from so-and-so. It can be any of those things. And every item, including instructional text, can have an enable when on it or multiple enable whens on it that say, turn this on if this particular question has an answer of any kind or has one of the following answers. And so we can do that. There's also some extensions in here that let you do more sophisticated things, so you can actually have logic that if question A says this, and B says this, and D does not say this, and the phase of the moon is whatever, then turn this on, or make this purple, or whatever it is that you want to do. So there's a certain amount of functionality in the core spec, and then with extensions you can do all sorts of weird, wild, and crazy things. Yes?
Is there a mechanism for feedback if a user changes an auto-populated value?
Something that we talked about. It's not something that's present in the SDC specification right now. The real question was, is that going to be useful information? Because there's, and do users actually want that information shared, is the other side of it. There's a number of different reasons for changing an auto-populated answer. The most common one is, yeah, that was good try, but no, that's not correct. So you're actually fixing it. Sometimes you're tuning the answer to who it's going to, because you know what they're actually wanting to know, and that's not necessarily what they're asking for. So you're giving them what they actually want to know. And sometimes it's because it's not any of your business, or from your perspective, the patient wants you to know this story, and therefore that's the story that I need to tell you because of the relationship that I have with the patient. So there's a number of different reasons for that. So simply flagging to say this was changed doesn't really give you actionable information, other than lets you go back and ask the question, which you're probably, if you're looking for, are you telling me the truth? You're going to get the answer of, I've given you exactly the information that the patient wants you to have a nice day, and you're not really any further ahead. Certainly something that we could do, but in the discussions that we had, we just didn't see a value for doing that, at least not right now. Other questions? So if you're interested in participating in the structured data capture project, it's going to be running as part of the FHIR infrastructure workgroup. Last time around it ran as part of orders and observations, but responsibility for questionnaire and questionnaire response and structure definition and value set now, well actually not value set, but the primary resources that we're dependent on, as well as structure map, which we're probably going to start to leverage, all live with FHIR infrastructure, so we're moving the project there, and look to see announcements on that listserv, as well as the OO listserv, and we'll probably post something on Zulip as well, chat.phir.org, letting you know that, hey, this project is happening, and here's when the conference calls are going to be, and we'll probably set up a specific list server for discussion about it. So look for that, monitor that, sign up to the list server if you can make the conference calls and you're interested in questionnaires or clinical research forms or forms for any other reason, please participate. Making calls that work for folks in Europe and North America and Australia is always fun. We'll do the best that we can. And join us or provide feedback, monitor what's going on, and let us know if this is something that's going to work for your implementation space, because that's, of course, our final objective. Yes?
Is there any tooling available to design FHIR questionnaires?
Is there any tooling available to design FHIR questionnaires? Yes. There's a few tools that have been created. One is a beta tool that Graham's produced, and Brian Postlethwaite, whose company is just totally gone out of my head, but he's here at the conference. He's the one who taught the questionnaire tutorial yesterday. Has a very sweet tool that does it as well. And if questionnaires follow the patterns of everything else. You start with 1 or 2 tools, and then more people build, and we certainly hope to see a proliferation of tools that are capable of doing that. NLM has been doing some work in that space as well, U.S. National Library of Medicine. All right, thank you all for your time, and I think it's time for lunch.